Welcome to lecture 18 of Software Requirements Engineering, CSE305, and in today's lecture we are going to talk about the negotiation process. If you guys remember, in our previous lecture we started talking about this process, but we could not finish it, and we are going to discuss it in detail. We are going to talk about what are the different activities within a negotiation process. We are also going to discuss out of those activities, specifically we are going to talk about requirements prioritization, and we are going to look at different state-of-the-art techniques which have been proposed, and we will be interested in looking at how can we automate this whole process of requirement prioritization, and our focus would be on few of those techniques which are automated techniques for requirement prioritization. But let's quickly recap, because another thing that we did in our previous lecture was another thing that we talked about in our previous lecture was elaboration process, and because it was a very detailed process and we had lots of lectures on it, so I wanted to recap the whole topic in one lecture. And we finished our discussion on structured analysis as well in the last lecture, and then we started summarizing elaboration process. So we looked at the elaboration process just in terms of the overall requirements engineering process. I just want you guys to remember where we are at the moment. So we have been using this diagram very regularly, and I would like that we again start our discussion with this particular diagram, that in requirement engineering we start with inception, then we do elicitation, and after or following elicitation we have this elaboration process. And each one of these processes, and remember our definition of a process, that every process it is basically a group of activities and it produces certain outputs. So we perform certain activities to achieve a goal, and out of the inception we want to figure out, we want to know about the product, we want to know about the stakeholders, and when we do elicitation we basically target those stakeholders and we try to identify requirements or try to elicit requirements from those identified stakeholders. Then came elaboration, and elaboration is also known as analysis. And when we talk about analyzing requirements, we analyze requirements to identify all the problematical requirements, because we don't want to continue with any conflicting, any inconsistent, or any ambiguous requirements. So that was the sole purpose of elaboration, that we want to increase our understanding of the product. So, and there were three goals that we were interested in. We wanted to know more about the information domain. So that was the first thing that we wanted. The second thing was to understand the functionality of the product, and the third was to understand the behavior. So it is very important to understand that when we are applying different analysis techniques, then each analysis technique that you use, it should help you in gaining one of these three objectives. If it's not helping you in increasing understanding in any way, or knowing more about the functionality of the product, or knowing more about the information domain, then it's not worth making that particular or using that particular diagram during the analysis process. So that was elaboration, and we said that at the end of the analysis we come up with lots of requirements. We have increased our understanding, and based on our understanding now we are in a better position to discuss the problematical requirements with the client, because in the end the client is the one who has to either accept whatever we have produced, or because whatever product we are going to make, and all the requirements that we have in the product, if the client is not happy with the scope that we have identified, he will not be accepting the product. So it will be, all the effort would be wasted. So because we have more understanding now we need to negotiate with the client. And negotiation, why is negotiation important? So one thing we all know, that negotiation is about getting to a consensus, and the consensus is between all the stakeholders involved. It is between the client, the end user, it is between your organization. So everybody needs to be happy about the scope that you are about the product scope that you are going to make. So negotiation is a process which helps you get to that consensus. So you have those conflicting requirements, and you have identified all those problematical requirements now, and you have increased your understanding of the system as well. Now you go and talk to the client and say, okay, because we also discussed another important thing about projects, or about software projects, that each software project, or generally a project, is constrained by it has mainly three constraints. So it has scope, it has cost, and it has time. So whatever scope we identified, we have to achieve the scope within these resources. So we have to strike a balance between these three things. So we cannot accept anything and everything that a client is going to tell us. So we need to negotiate with them and say, okay, within the limited resources we have, and resources can be in terms of money that you have, or in terms of time that that you guys are given for the project, you can only do this much. So but you need a certain mechanism or a systematic way to actually discuss that with the client. You cannot simply say no to a client, but you need a proper method to negotiate with somebody. And as we said, at times we say that negotiation is an art, and we can actually see it from our own daily lives, that some of our friends, when we go for shopping, some people are really good at negotiation, whereas some they don't. And so it's an art on its own. But people can learn about it. And because we are talking about software requirements engineering, and we are saying that there is a proper mechanism of doing everything, so we can say that negotiation, we will try to identify what are the different steps that a requirement analyst can use when doing negotiation, and what are the things to look for when doing negotiation, and specifically when we conduct those negotiation meetings with the client, how to conduct them, and what are the things to look for when we are in those meetings. So in the requirements engineering process, we are at this stage at the moment. We are talking about requirements negotiation. We are here. Okay, so let's see what we are going to talk about today. And as I already said, we are continuing our discussion with the negotiation process. So we are here within negotiation, as we have said, that every process, let's say negotiation is a process, it will be basically a set of activities. So we need to identify, okay, what are the different activities that we can do in negotiation to actually achieve that consensus that we want. Similarly, then there is an important concept in negotiation. You conduct negotiation meetings, and negotiation meetings, they are also decomposed into different stages. So the first stage normally in a meeting is that you inform all the stakeholders, okay, that is the reason why we are here, and then you give the stakeholders enough time to actually express give their opinion, that why they thought what they have written, and then you try to get to a consensus. Then finally, out of one of the activities of the negotiation process, this requirement prioritization, it is one of the activities that we do during negotiation. So what we are going to talk about specifically, that what is requirement prioritization and why it is important to prioritize requirements. Then we are going to also look at some of the techniques that are being proposed for prioritizing requirements. Obviously, they can be very you may not need a technique. For example, there's just imagine that there is one person who has to prioritize requirements, then it's not a problem. Okay, because if I am somebody who has to decide, okay, in which order things needs to be done, and everybody would agree to it, then prioritization is not a problem. But it becomes a problem when there are more than one people who have their say, and you have to prioritize requirements, and all of them, they believe the prioritization order is different. Then you need a technique, then you need an approach to actually come to a consensus, okay, that is the prioritized list of requirements. So let's start our today's lecture. And so just I wanted this picture again, because I wanted to start our lecture with this, that negotiation as a process. So remember our definition of a process, that what we are looking for is that we know that what we have here. So we know that as an input to the negotiation process, we have mainly three things, okay, or mainly just one thing, which is problematical requirements. Or you can say all the requirements. We have all the requirements here. We also have some problematical requirements that we have identified within those all the set of requirements. And now what we want is, we want to reach a consensus. We want to reach a consensus in terms of the order of development of these requirements, that which requirements need to be taken up first when you are producing the product. Similarly, we also need to prioritize requirements to resolve the conflicts with the requirements. So the conflicts within the more important requirements, we need a resolution to those requirements first, then to the least priority ones. So negotiation as a process, we know that what are the inputs to this process and what is the output of this process. And when we talk about consensus, then this output can also be broken down into smaller items. For example, when we say consensus, then what do we do with the requirements? There are three possibilities with each conflicted requirement. For example, what we do is we either change or modify it so that everybody is happy, we either delete it. So that's another option, that we say, okay, this is a problematical requirement and this is not really important, so let's just get rid of it. And everybody say, okay, because this was, the priority was not that high, so we may delete it. And similarly, we also talk about that another thing that we can do is we say, okay, we were not able to elicit this particular feature in detail, so let's spend more time in eliciting. So we go back to elicitation, and that's why I said that these processes, they are not sequential as such, these requirement engineering processes. So you can actually go back and forth, and when you're coming to a resolution specifically. So if we look at these outputs, we know that requirement negotiation is not just one activity, it's basically a group of activities, for example, and these cannot be achieved by just one activity. So we need an activity to prioritize requirements, we need an activity to actually decide that which are requirements to delete, which to modify, for which to do more elicitation. So let's look at what, and try to identify what are the activities within a negotiation process. So what do we do during negotiation? The software engineer reconciles the conflicts between what the customer wants and what can be achieved given limited business resources. So this is the crux of negotiation, that we have to reconcile the requirements. And what we have is, on one side we have the client who has endless wishes, and on the other hand we know that there's so much money that the client is willing to pay me, and there is so much time that I have to develop this particular product. So we need a consensus. We need to reconcile. We need to tell the client, okay, within the time and within the cost, this is not possible to, and we have to actually come to a consensus about it. Then another thing that is done, or one of the activities that may exist during negotiation, is that requirements are ranked by the customer, users, and other stakeholders. Now you can see that why prioritization is a problem, that there are lots of people involved. There is customer, there are end users, and then there is all the stakeholders. We have to rank the requirements thinking about all these people, and all of these guys, they would have multiple viewpoints about the product, and they would want certain features to be done first. For them, the priority or the rank of different requirements would be higher than the others. So that's why prioritization is a problem. And as I said, if there is just one person prioritizing requirement, then it's not a problem. It will become a problem when we have more than one people who wants to rank these requirements in different orders. Then the next thing is that risk associated with each requirements are identified and analyzed. So we can say that risk analysis is also part of requirement negotiation, because what we do is we try to identify, okay, that what are the possible problems that can occur with with this requirement. For example, if certain hardware you're trying to buy, maybe that the supplier is ending that particular product line, so that's a risk. Or maybe that technology you're using will no longer be supported by the vendor or something like that. Or similarly, you can also identify lots of other risks associated with each requirements. And when we identify those risks, another thing that we do is we try to understand the impact of each requirement in terms of time and cost. So we try to say, okay, this is requirement 1, how much time it is going to take for us to actually develop this particular feature in the product. And finally, using an iterative approach, these requirements are eliminated, combined, or modified so that each party achieves some measure of satisfaction. So if we actually look at these things, then we can say that we have sort of identified what are the different activities within negotiation process. For example, we can say that the first activity within negotiation might be that we are prioritizing requirements. So prioritization is maybe the first activity. Then the next one is maybe the risk analysis. So we can say, okay, we are doing risk analysis of each requirement. That is another activity. Then we try to evaluate the impact of each requirement, which we can say it's another activity. And then we have a group of activities where what we are trying to do, either we are eliminating requirements, or we are combining requirements, or we are modifying. So basically, these three things, we do this particular, it's kind of a sub process within negotiation, where we are trying to reconcile. And so this is the fourth activity, or it's a small sub process with certain smaller activities within it. So let's try to draw this whole process in the form of a flowchart, that how negotiation would be conducted. So what are the different stages that we have identified in the previous slide? So we can either call them stages, or we can also call them different activities. So we can say that we do prioritization. So one thing that we do is that we prioritize the requirements. Okay, we know that. Another thing that we do is we do some sort of risk assessment or risk identification, we can call. We try to identify risk associated with each particular requirement, and then next up what we do is we try to do impact analysis, impact on cost and time. So for each requirement we try to evaluate what will be the impact of this particular requirement on time and cost. And finally what we do is we can call that we have a smaller sub process here, which is basically, you know, reconciling process. And within this reconciling process, and we say that this is an iterative process, so it's an iterative process. We keep on doing it until we reach a conclusion, and this output is basically, you know, reconciled, we can call it reconciled set of requirements. So if we try to look at it, you know, we've said that, you know, these are the different activities within negotiation. So for example, we start off with requirement prioritization, and as we know that whenever an activity is performed, it consumes something and then it produces something. So for example, what is this prioritization activity consuming? We know that the input to the negotiation process is basically input to this prioritization step. So we have either we pass it all the requirements, or we are going to pass it depending on, you know, what this negotiation is about. If it's about just deciding that which requirements to be executed first, or for example we need to hand it over to our development or other software engineers, and we want to figure out that which requirements are more important to the client and which requirements we think are important for this particular product, so we are going to send in all the requirements to this negotiation process. But if we are just trying to resolve the problems with all the problematical requirements, for example, then we are going to send it all the problematical requirements. So when we look at this prioritization activity in detail, then you guys would see that, you know, it's a process on its own. That prioritization is not a smaller thing, because for example, you know, depending on what do you want, what you are sending as an input to this prioritization process. For example, if we just want to determine resolve the conflicts, or resolve the ambiguities, or resolve the inconsistencies, then our prioritization criteria are different. Whereas when we are just sending in all the requirements, and we want to figure out that according to the domain experts and according to maybe the client or the end user, which requirements are important to be executed and what should be the order of execution of these requirements, then that prioritization would give a different output, and maybe some parameters needs to be tweaked within that prioritization activity or within that prioritization process. But when we talk about negotiation, let's say that prioritization is a task or is an activity where we, depending on what we want or what we are looking for, it basically, the output of this particular activity would be prioritized requirements. So when we have this list of prioritized requirements, what we want now is we want to do some risk assessment. So what we do is, for example, we have list of, for example, R1, R2, and this 1, 2, 3 is the prioritization order, let's say. So what we try to do now is, against each requirement, we will try to list the risks. So we'll list all the risks which are associated with each of one of these requirements, because these risks are would be helpful when we are doing this, when we are performing this next activity. So for example, this risk assessment or risk identification activity is going to identify the risks with all requirements. So now we know what are the risks associated with each requirement, and based on this input, now we can conduct an impact analysis. So our impact analysis may yield different results. For example, you know, if this risk occur, then the impact of completing this requirement on cost and time would be different. So this is helpful in actually analyzing this or performing this particular activity. And let's say the output of this is the impact analysis. So now we know that, for example, this requirement is going to take, you know, a certain amount of money. So we say rupees, and we also know the time, for example, 15 days or something. So if we can do that, then this is sort of really helpful. And why this is helpful? Because we have prioritized requirements, we have identified risks with all those requirements. We have done their impact analysis now. And now we are in a process where we know all these things. And now we are so knowledgeable now that when we discuss it with the client, we can actually tell him, okay, that you want this really badly, but this feature cannot be implemented in less than a month. And all the projects would stop because of that. And if you have these kind of figures in front of the client, then you are in a better position to negotiate with the end user or with the customer. So all these things, they would help us in doing this negotiation, in finally in reconciling the requirement. Because what we do in reconciliation is that we discuss with the client, we either delete the requirements, we either modify them, or we either change them. And we always say that this is an iterative process. So we keep on doing it, and all the stakeholders are satisfied. So these are the different steps, and these are the different stages within the negotiation process. So, and as I said during the start of the lecture, that negotiation is believed to be an art. We are trying to make it a science by identifying, that, okay, what is the process and what are the different activities. But there are few things that you need to adapt in order to become a good negotiator. So the first thing that you need to know when you go to negotiate with anybody, or specifically, with your customer, is that it's not a competition. So when you are there and you are trying to come to a consensus with the client, then remember that what you think, although you might think it's really important, but when you're discussing with the client, it should not appear that way. So if you make it a competition, then your negotiation is going to fail. So you have to give respect to the other person's opinion, and you have to so it's not a competition. That is very important. And you need to map out a strategy. So you need to be very careful. You need to prepare well for the negotiated meeting. So you need to think about all the possible scenarios, all the things that can go wrong, or you need to identify, okay, what would be the client response if I tell him that, and you need to be prepared for all kind of responses. And it's always important that you sit with your team and you discuss, okay, when you're going to go there, these are the options, and when you're going to give these options to the client, if he selects option A, option B, option C, what would be our response? So you need to properly map out a strategy before going into this negotiation meeting. And as I said, that you need to listen very actively. So for example, if I'm your customer and you are there to negotiate with me, and I have lots of different things that I want in the product, but you are there to tell me, okay, that these things cannot be done, but I'm telling you my perspective, that why I want these things in my product. And if you're not listening to me properly, if you're talking to your teammates and you're busy looking at other pages of the document, then this won't look good. So when you're negotiating, try to listen to the person whom you are negotiating with. So that is very important thing to remember when we are negotiating. So we need to focus on other parties' interests. So a very good negotiator, what he would do, he would make other person believe that actually he is winning. And so this is a very important thing that you need to remember, that when you are in negotiation, then listen very actively and focus on what the other person is asking for, and taking his point of view, try to express, okay, we will do that, but try to listen very actively and try to give importance to other person's opinion as well. And it's not personal, and this is kind of sort of related to the competition bit, that if it's not personal, it's not a competition, and it is not what you want. It is what is best for this particular product or for this particular project. And you need to be creative. You might end up in certain kind of scenarios where which you haven't thought of, because when a meeting is going on, then somebody says something which you haven't really thought of earlier. So you need to be creative, and you need to be really quick on your feet, and so you need to come up with new answers for certain reasons, and you need to be ready to commit. So for example, people who does not have enough power to commit, they can never be good negotiators. So for example, I go out for shopping, and I am trying to negotiate with somebody, but I don't really have the money to buy it. So I can never commit. So I can never be a good negotiator. Okay. So you need to be ready to commit. For example, if you tell somebody a very low price of something, and he says, okay, give me the money and buy it. And because I don't have the money, I'm not ready to commit. So as a negotiator, it is really important that you are given the power to actually commit to certain things. So just remember these things. We've talked about that negotiation is a process, and we're going to look at those activities also in detail. But it's an art, and you need to remember a few of those things, that it's not a competition. You need to prepare well. You need to listen very actively. You need to focus on what other person is is asking for. You need to be creative, and you should be given the authority to commit to something. Okay, and the next thing is that that how do we actually, or what are the things that we do in these meetings, that how to conduct this negotiation meeting. We have seen that it's an art. We have seen how the negotiation, what are the different activities within a negotiation process, but that final sub process, which is the reconciling process, is basically all about these negotiation meetings. So how do we do it? So normally these negotiation meetings, they are decomposed into different stages. So the first stage is the information stage, the second stage is the discussion stage, and finally we have the resolution stage. So in the information stage, what do we do is that we need to inform the client. Okay, so we basically, what we do is that, and it's the stage where the nature of the problems associated with the requirement is explained. So this is basically concerned for a meeting where you're going to where we are there to resolve the conflicts with the requirements. So the idea is that lots of people are sitting there, and you have asked for certain stakeholders from whom you have gathered the requirements earlier, and you have all the people, you have all the audience. Now important thing is to actually discuss the problem. So you first need to inform them before actually going to discussion. So you need to tell them that why you think this requirement is problematical, or why you think this requirement is incomplete, or why you think this requirement is ambiguous, or what are the inconsistencies between these two requirements. So you need to inform all the stakeholders. And the next stage is the discussion stage. So in the discussion stage, the stakeholders involved, all the people who are sitting there, they discuss how these problems might be resolved. So you give the people, for example, there were inconsistent requirements, and there were two group of stakeholders. One group wanted some things in a certain way, the other group were saying the same feature, but they wanted it in a totally different fashion. So there is inconsistency between what they want, or there were slight variations in the functionality they wanted. So what should happen at the discussion stage? So all the stakeholders who are sitting there with an interest, they should be given a chance to comment on those problematical requirements, and you can also assign priorities to the requirements at that particular stage. Similarly, the final stage of this whole negotiation meeting is the resolution stage. So resolution is about taking actions. And what are the three possible actions that we can take? We can either delete a certain requirement, we can either modify it, or we can say, okay, let's do some more elicitation and try to figure out that if we can get to a resolution by knowing more about this particular process or about this particular requirements. So when we go in a meeting, it should be decomposed into three main steps. So we need to inform all the people involved, we need to give them a chance to discuss and maybe assign priorities as well, and finally we need to resolve. So these are the three main stages when you go into a negotiation meeting. So when we go in a negotiation meeting, the first thing that we do is inform people. So information step is the first step, and when we inform people, then we give them a chance to discuss, and then finally we try to resolve. And there should be an output of this particular step. So when we're talking about this information step, then what do we do is that, because there are lots of people and you might have elicited requirements from them in separate interviews, or you conducted separate sessions with those groups of stakeholders. So now because all of them are sitting together and those were the people with problematical requirements, so you need to tell all interested stakeholders about the problem for which they are gathered. And when we are saying discussion, then what you do is that you give the stakeholders, so first thing that you do is that stakeholders give their opinion, or they basically comment that why we think this should be done in this particular fashion, and they might assign priorities at that stage as well. And once you have done these two things, that you have given the stakeholders a chance to comment on the requirements or comment on why they think that, why they thought that this particular feature should be done in this particular fashion, then the final is the resolution stage. And within resolution, there are three things that we do. We have talked about this again and again now, that when we are resolving the requirements, we either change them or modify them, we either delete them, or we kind of spend more time on them. And when we say we are spending more time on them, we are trying to elicit again, we are trying to know more about the process, and by doing so we are thinking, okay, that we might reach a resolution by doing that. So again, we are trying to be as systematical about this negotiation process as we can be. We have said that negotiation process is decomposed into certain activities. We do prioritization, we do risk identification, we do impact analysis, and then we talked about this reconciliation process. And when we said that we are actually in that reconciliation process, which is an iterative process, we talked about it. This is basically done in the form of a meeting. So how do we conduct this meeting? So within that iterative reconciliation process, or when we are conducting this negotiation meeting, it is divided into three main stages or three main steps. First is the information step, or where we inform all the stakeholders. Then is the discussion step, and the final one is the resolution step. So as I said, I'm going to talk about one of the activities of the negotiation process. So we are going to talk about requirements prioritization. And it's important to place that where this requirement prioritization lies. So first thing we know about requirement prioritization is that this is one of the things that we do when we are within the requirement engineering process. So we know that if for example this is the big circle where we call it that this is software engineering, then within software engineering somewhere we do is what we have a big process which we call requirements engineering process, which is basically the title of this course of ours, requirements engineering. And within requirement engineering we say that somewhere this thing lies which we call requirement prioritization. And we now know that within this requirement engineering process there are other smaller processes. So we know that this requirement prioritization, it lies within negotiation. So we know where it lies, and we have seen that why we are going to talk about prioritization. It's important to establish here that this is something which can become very tricky. Okay? And so far lots of research have been done on this particular topic, but there isn't a tool which is sort of very applicable, and people in industry, in practice, they don't see it as big a problem. And what they do is that there would always be 2 or 3 people in a company. For example, once you get a project, then there are 2 or 3 key people who actually sit together, and then they sort of prioritize requirements. And they do not follow any of these proposed methods in the literature. So what they do is they actually, knowingly or unknowingly, they assign their own weightages to different requirements, and based on those weightages they try to come up with a conclusion. Or they don't have a piece of paper where they have written all the requirements, and then they say, okay, I think this requirement should be given 5 out of 10, and the other person say, no, I think this should be given 8 out of 10. So they don't actually score them in such a fashion, but what they do is they actually discuss among themselves, and based on their discussion they say, okay, this is, I think, the order in which we should go about it. So there is a gap in terms of in practice and in literature or in academia when we talk about this prioritization process, because there doesn't exist a tool or a technique which is really applicable, or which is readily usable for the people in industry, because they do not see it as big a problem. And lots of research have been done. We are going to talk about some of the techniques of requirements prioritization. But before we get to it, we also need to discuss that why this prioritization is a problem. Imagine the 2 scenarios that we have talked about in negotiation. So there are 2 possibilities when we are negotiating requirements. The first possibility is that, so there are 2 options. So the first option is that we are doing negotiation to determine the order of execution. And remember this constraint problem, that we know that we have only certain amount of time and we have only so much money to actually complete a project, and we want to determine what should be the order of execution of these requirements. And the second thing that we talk about, that why we go into negotiation, is to resolve those problematical requirements. So that is another thing why we do this negotiation within the requirements engineering process. So if we are just determining the order of execution, then just try to imagine that, you know, whose input would be kind of more important. You're trying to decide what features should be developed first. So one thing that you can be very clear about is that obviously, you know, the stakeholder or the customer, he would have a very strong say about it. You know, he would say, okay, you know, this is something which I really want. Okay, but you cannot just accept everything what the client says. So you need certain, you know, domain experts, or you need your team leaders, maybe who's somebody who's very experienced with, you know, these kind of projects, and he knows what things, if done first, then they actually become the core of the product. Imagine we are using an incremental process, let it be Agile, Scrum, or you know, the traditional incremental model. Even if you deliver the product in increment to the client, usually what happens in those incremental models is that the first increment or the first functionality that you give to the client is actually the core of the product, and you never change the core, and you build around the core of the product. So you need to actually determine, okay, which things, if done first, would actually mean that my product would be stable, my product would be more customizable, it will be more reliable, and, you know, it would have good quality features or good quality attributes. So order of execution is important. So just think that, you know, let's say we have these three people, and, you know, we have one representative from the client, and we have one domain expert, and we have one team leader. So there are three people. Each one of them has their own say. For example, you know, the client is interested in, you know, knowing that, you know, he has ranked all these requirements depending on, you know, which functionality he wants. Whereas the domain experts, because he's so familiar with this particular domain, he says, okay, this area of the product needs to be done first. Whereas the team lead says, no, I think that because he is more into technology and stuff, so he knows that, you know, which features. So these three people, the stakeholders, domain expert, and team leader, all of them, they have their own criteria for prioritizing requirements. And let's say there are three requirements, and the stakeholder, which is represented by C, and the domain expert, which is represented by D, and the team leader, which is represented by T. Now let's say client says that his prioritization order is R2, R1, R2, and R3. And he wants R1 to be done first, R2 to be done second, and R3 to be done at third place. Whereas when we talk to the domain expert, he says, no, R3 is usually the most important thing when you talk about these kind of projects. This should be done first, and then R2, and then R1. Okay. And now when we go to and talk to our team lead, he says, no, I think that R2 is something which is important, and that should be done first, and then we should do R3, and then we should do R1. So now we have three set of requirements. So basically we have same set of requirements, but we have three. These requirements are ranked according to three guys, you know, who are kind of important, and who have to actually come to a conclusion that, you know, which things should be done first. And each one of them has their own criteria. For example, the client, he just thinks that, you know, this is the thing which he wants first, whereas the domain expert says, okay, no, in my opinion, you know, if we do R3 first, then we are going to save more time, because this is how these projects are done. Whereas the team leader says, no, for this particular client, we need to do R2 first, because I think that is the core of the product. So all these three guys, they have their own. Now we need to either these three guys, they sit together and they just talk it out, or there can be a technique to actually come to a conclusion. So that's why it's a problem on its own. And same is the case even if we look at all these problematical requirements, then normally what we would have here is we would have what kind of people would be there? So there would be stakeholders, and then there would be requirement analysts. So these two guys would be there, and when we talk about stakeholders, there can be multiple groups. So for example, S1 represent one group, S2 represent another group, and R represent requirement analysts. Now according to S1, we might get a different a list of rank of requirements, or S2 can give a different a set of ranked requirements, and requirement analyst would have his own ranking of requirements. Or let's say, let's forget requirement analyst, and we just need to resolve, what these two guys, and we need to come up with one sort of prioritization of requirements, and we need to satisfy these two stakeholders. But if you look at these two scenarios within negotiation, why we need to prioritize requirements, then we can actually see that this prioritization step is it will also be kind of more complex than just one activity, because depending on what we want to achieve from this prioritization process, or depending on what the goal of this prioritization process, we need to tweak some parameters. So we need to look into this problem a bit more deeply. So it's not just an activity. We need to actually think about that what are the things that are done when we are prioritizing requirements. So we have seen why requirements prioritization is a problem. Now just let's look at some of the techniques which have been proposed in literature to prioritize requirements. Now this particular pie chart, it shows some of the techniques of prioritization which exist, and we have sort of decomposed these techniques into semi-automated and totally manual requirement prioritization techniques. And from these techniques, we can see that most of the requirement prioritization techniques, they are manual. So by manual, we are saying that they would be depending on what kind of prioritization you are doing. For example, we are trying to resolve the conflicts between requirements, and we have different set of stakeholders sitting together. So what would happen is that you will manually ask different stakeholders to rank different requirements, and manually you will come to a conclusion, okay, that this is the reconciled setup, or this is the final rank of the requirements based on the prioritization given by different stakeholders. So a very simple manual way can be that, for example, there are two stakeholders, and you ask each one of them to give priorities to each requirement from a scale of 1 to 10, and then you can also give weightages to these two stakeholders. So you can say, okay, stakeholder number 1 has a weight of 3, and stakeholder 2 has a weight of 2, with 3 being a greater value, and it means that stakeholder 1 opinion would matter more maybe. So then you try to maybe come to conclusion that based on these weights and based on the what priorities these guys gave to these different requirements, what is the final rank of requirements. So this may be the manual way. And what would be the semi-automated? It cannot be fully automated. So so the techniques which actually say that we have come to a conclusion, we have an automated requirement prioritization technique. It cannot be fully automated because there is some manual effort in there, because manually some domain expert or one of the guys within this, one of the stakeholders of this prioritization process, these people, they have to input their prioritization, and that is where these techniques, they become manual to some extent. That's why we call them semi-automated. They are not completely automated. So among those manual techniques, there are lots of techniques which exist. For example, we have triage, we have cost value analysis, we have planning game, we have Wieger's method, win-win, QFD, serum, and there are lots of these techniques. And then when we talk about these semi-automated techniques, we have EHP, which is one of very famous techniques. We also have CB rank. We have techniques based on genetic algorithms. We have techniques based on different sorting algorithms. So what we are going to do is we are going to look at few of these techniques and see how they actually operate. And towards the end of the lecture, I've also put all the references. So for example, if you guys are interested in knowing more about these techniques, you can go and read those papers in detail yourself as well. But the idea is just to give you a flavor that how academics actually solve this problem. And you guys would, and towards the end of the lecture, we are again going to talk about that gap that exists between academia and industry when we are talking about this prioritization problem. So out of these semi-automated techniques, let's say we want to identify that which one of these techniques they are intelligent, okay? Because if a technique is actually based on getting all the inputs from humans and then analyze that input and then come to a conclusion, that is not intelligent. Whereas we call intelligent techniques which uses one of those maybe artificial intelligence algorithm. For example, it may use machine learning, or it may use any evolutionary algorithm. For example, CBR in this case, or CB rank method, or case-based ranking method is one method which uses machine learning, for example. Then we have other techniques which uses genetic algorithms. So we are going to see, specifically we are going to look at CB rank method because it's one of the recently published research on this topic of requirement prioritization, and it uses machine learning to prioritize requirements. So let's look at few of these techniques, and we are going to quickly skim through these. And if you guys want to know more about these topics, then the references are given in this slide, and the details of these references are are given at the end of the lecture. So, so the first technique uses analytic hierarchical processing, AHP, and this is one of the most used technique in literature. So so mainly what it does is that if you have, let's say, sort of n requirements, then you try to compare each requirement with the other requirements. So for example, let's say we have 3 requirements. So let's say we have 3 requirements. What we'll do, we are going to make a matrix. So for example, what we would do is we'll say we have R1, we'll have R2, R3, and we have 3 rows and we have 3 columns. So R1, R2, R3. So let's not worry about, you know, these. And so what we are going to do is we are going to compare R1 to R2 and R3. Similarly, we are going to compare R2 to R1 and R3. We are going to compare R3 to R1 and R2. And we are going to evaluate that which requirement is actually more important than the other requirement. And we are going to do it for with multiple stakeholders. So what we'll get is that, first of all, we'll get different values in these columns. So we try to normalize these values. And so let's say we come up with, you know, all those different estimates, and we have normalized those columns. So what we do is, on the basis of those different eigenvalues, what we do is we try to give relative value to each requirement in comparison to the other requirements, and then we sort of make a diagram to show the scale of each requirement. So this is how AHP works and how it actually evaluates. So what we are trying to do is we're trying to give a hierarchy to our problem, and then we elicit judgments that replicate the ideas, emotions, and feelings, or whatever is the criteria of different stakeholders. Then we have this representation of these judgments, which we say that this is in the form of the matrix. We use these numbers. So we have identified those. We say that within those columns we have different values. So we use these numbers to get the elements in the prioritized form in hierarchy. We synthesize the results. So changes in the judgment to analyze the sensitivity. It calculates the scales of each requirement in terms of cost, benefits, and risk. So we say that, you know, we draw the scale of each requirement. So this scale is basically used in terms of the cost, benefit, and risk. Now, what is the problem with AHP? It can work with a smaller set of requirements. So for example, we have, you know, a smaller set of requirements. We have 20, 30 requirements. But when the problem becomes really large, and let's say we have hundreds of requirements, then it might not be applicable. So as I said, that it is not useful for large projects. It helps to reduce hindrances in the decision. It's a very lengthy process. It's a time-consuming process because, as you can see, that, you know, as the problem size increases, the complexity of this process is going to increase, and it is also a semi-automated process, as we guys have already seen in our earlier slide. Next up, we have this planning game technique. So how it's done? So requirements written on cards, which are further divided into 3 different lots. The lots get the sorted list on an ordinal scale. So on the basis of those requirements that are essential for the system to be functional, those requirements which are not much important but given substantial value, those requirements that would be pleasant to have in the system. So we sort of say, okay, what are the things that without which the product cannot function? So these are really important. Then we want that, you know, we also give value to some requirements which are important. And then there are some requirements which are the customer wishes. If he gets it, it's okay, but if he doesn't, he's also fine. So what we do is we try to sort the requirements into 3 different piles. So all the candidate requirements are outlined. Each requirement is put into the appropriate pile and continues until all the requirements are sorted. So let's imagine that we have requirements, each requirement written on a piece of card, and what we are doing is that we are making different piles. We are saying, okay, this pile is of the most important requirements, or these are the features without which this product cannot function. So all the requirements that are really important for the product, we are going to put them here, and all the requirements which are the customer wishes, we are going to put them here, and all the important requirements which are important, but again we need to we can decide, okay, which order they should be done. We make another pile of them. So this method, how this method performs, it is very flexible. It does not support regression testing. It is used in extreme programming. So normally what we have in extreme programming, if you guys remember that in extreme programming we have this requirement written on story cards. So it is very applicable, or this method is actually proposed to be used with the extreme programming method, and it's a completely manual method. So you guys can see that you have requirement written on pieces of cards, and you are actually sorting these requirements, and you're making different piles. You're piling them. इसको दोबारा से करें जी. So as you can see that this is a manual method. Why it's manual? Because it has humans are involved, and what they are doing is that they have all those set of requirements, and they're putting each requirement in a different group based on its importance to the product. Then another technique is this Moscow, and all the requirements are grouped into 4 priority groups. So must have, should have, could have, and won't have. So as you guys saw that in the planning game we have 3 main categories. In the Moscow we have 4 categories. So how this Moscow operates, it used in dynamic systems, keeping overview of important aspects of the project, and this is also a manual method. And the problem with this method is, if not done efficiently, then it could cause failure of requirements. So there is a slight mistake here in the slide, so it's basically then it's not I, so it could cause failure of requirements. So so this is again a manual method. So next up we have two of those semi-automated intelligent techniques. The first one uses genetic algorithms, and the other is the case-based ranking method, which uses machine learning. And so how do they work actually? How do they actually minimize the problems? So the first thing is that because they are completely automated, and we do not have, so it's not completely manual. So a machine needs to make some decisions. So what we do is we try to reduce the scope of the problem. And normally what happens with this requirement prioritization problem is that, let's say we have 40 requirements, and normally people will come to consensus about lots of requirements, but there would be some requirements which would be problematical. So for example, this genetic algorithm technique, it is not used to compare all those elicited pairs of requirements, but the comparison is only done for those pairs for which there is still conflict, or for which the consensus cannot be made, and it uses a genetic algorithm to actually come to a conclusion about the ordering of where to put those 2 requirements, for example, in the overall set of ranked requirements. And as we see that because the problem size is reduced, this problem is scalable. But again, as we say that this problem is only applicable to selective elicitation on allocated budget. And as we said that this is a semi-automated and an intelligent technique. Next up is the CB rank method. As I said, it is based on machine learning. Basically, it has 3 main steps. CB rank method. The first step is the pair sampling. Then we do this priority elicitation. So again, it reduces the scope, and we say that there would be few pairs of the requirements for which we cannot determine that which requirement should be done first. So what we do is that for those pairs, we first of all figure out, okay, what are these pairs, and then we do priority elicitation of those pairs. So from all the people who are involved in this prioritization process, we are going to ask them, okay, can you please prioritize these pair of requirements and give your ranking. And then the machine learning algorithm is used to intelligently, iteratively come up with the final rank of those requirements. Now, what are the advantages and the problems with this method is flexible. It can be used for a large number of requirements. It also addresses somewhat the issue of scalability. But one thing that's sort of missing with the CB rank method is that is the ability to negotiate with the stakeholders. So the one problem that this method is slightly biased in favor of the stakeholder who is given more weight. Now, I mean that is the purpose of given weights, that you normally want the stakeholder who has more weight to influence, to have more influence on decisions. But what we have seen when we apply this method, CB rank method, practically that what happens is that it actually ignores the ranking given, or the, for example, let's say there are 3 people involved, and one guy is given of weight 1, the other is given 0.5, and so 3 people are given different weights. So what it would do is it would only take into opinion the rank of the stakeholder who is given more weight. So that is one slight problem with the CB rank method, although otherwise it is scalable, it is automated, it is also intelligent as well, and it is flexible enough. So how does this CB rank method work? So the first thing that we have said is that what it does pair sampling. So from all the list of pairs, what it is going to do, it would select some pairs. So for example, it is selected R1, R2, and R3, R4 from the set of 5 requirements. So next step, what is the priority elicitation step. So what happens in this priority elicitation step, it is actually very close to what we said, that how we can actually think this prioritization problem can be solved. That let's say you have 3 different people, or let's say even you have 2 different people, or even if there is one person involved, and according to him these requirements, they can be ranked in different orders, depending on different criterion. So for example, he has 3 different functions, and if he thinks about just function 1, this is the rank of requirement. If he thinks about function 2, this is the rank of the requirement. If he thinks about function 3, this is the rank of requirement. So what you do is, so this is kind of the manual step, and that's why we call it semi-automated, because we asked somebody to we asked a human to rank the requirements. It can be one person, it can be multiple person. For example, function 1 may be the criteria of stakeholder 1, function 2 may be the criteria of domain expert, and function 3 may be criteria of another domain expert or a team leader. And then comes the final step, which is the priority learning. And priority learning is about that, that we now have this priority elicitation, and we know that there were some pairs for which we were not sure of their prioritization order. Now we are going to apply this priority learning, and based on, then different weights are given to different stakeholders ranking as well. We come to a conclusion of what would be the final rank of requirements. And once again, I've not actually gone into a lot of detail that how this priority learning actually works. For that, you can go and look at the references which are given here. So this is the reference for the CB rank method, this is the reference for our genetic algorithm paper, and this is the reference for the Moscow paper, and this is for planning game, and we have these 2 references are for AHP. So if you guys are interested in knowing more about these techniques, you can go and have a look at these papers, and one of them is the book and the rest are the papers. So you can have a look at all these and know more about this prioritization problem. But what we can actually appreciate by looking at these different methods is what I wanted to tell you guys, that why I thought this is important to discuss, is that there is a gap. And as a requirement analyst, or as a researcher, as academicians, we have not been able to solve this prioritization problem in a fashion that is readily usable by the people working in industry. So, people, for example, even smaller companies, they have multiple projects going on, and they have lots of people telling them, what are the things to do. So we need a mechanism which is not too information intensive and which is easy to use, because one of the things with all these different techniques which are being proposed, that some of them, they are too complex to be used, and people or the practitioners, they don't actually use them because in order to understand them, it will take too much time, or they don't have actually time to give all these inputs and identify what are the different pairs and these kind of things. So it is important that we think about, that what are the good solutions of prioritizing requirements, or what is ideal way of prioritizing requirements, because there is always a trade-off. If you make something too simple, then it is not it will not maybe give very good results. But if you make something very complex, it may give you very good results, but actually applying it in practice is impossible. And that is why what is the main problem with this particular prioritization problem. So that is it from today's lecture. We have in today's lecture we talked about the negotiation process. So we have seen what is the negotiation process in detail. We have identified what are the different activities within negotiation, and moreover within those activities we have looked at in detail about requirement prioritization. So what is requirement prioritization? We have looked at it. We have seen what are the different techniques which are being proposed by different researchers. Similarly, we have also looked at what are the different stages of this reconciliation process, or we call it the negotiation meeting. We have also looked at these things as well. So that is it from our discussion in today's lecture. In the next lecture we are going to talk about, very briefly we are going to discuss that how the impact of each requirement can be gauged, because that was one of the things that we said is part of the negotiation process. And hopefully we'll conclude negotiation process in the next lecture, and we'll start discussing the specification process within the requirement engineering process. So take care, and inshallah I will see you in the next lecture. Assalamu alaikum.